And I'm coming across okay to you?
So we have a wonderful pleasure and a great honor to have with us Professor Kathleen Eisenhardt, who is the Stanford Ascherman M.D. professor and a faculty member of the Stanford Technology Ventures Program. Good afternoon, Professor Eisenhardt. Thank you so much for the great honor to have you with us and share your amazing knowledge about case studies. So this is an opportunity to share your thoughts and suggestions and advice with our PhD students of EDAMBA, and in the opportunity of celebrating 30 years and also the Summer Research Academy, where we also celebrate 30 years. I read with interest that you added to your over 100 publications, books and papers, your recent book on simple rules, how to survive in a complex world. So what does it mean, a complex world and simple rules for Kathleen Eisenhardt? Could you say a few words for us? Thank you.
Of course. And thank you, May, for inviting me, and welcome to everyone at EDAMBA. I'm sorry I can't be there live or even recording live. I've had some plans, but thank you. Yeah, what does simple rules mean in a complex world? It means there's a lot going on as we all are navigating, whether it's our personal life or our business life, professional life. There's a lot going on. And what I found over some studies with Don Sull, as well as Don and myself working independently and other people's work, is that the people who seem to be the most successful were people who had a very simple approach to whatever it was they were doing, a simple way of saying, this is what's important to me. This is how I'm going to do it. This is when I'm going to stop doing things. And so it was that simplicity, whether it was dieting or it was business, it was a few simple rules that made sense to people, rules that gave them flexibility in different situations, and rules that were perhaps unique to them. So that was really where it came from, this idea of when the world is seeming overwhelming, what are the couple of rules that you want to focus on, which you can do when you're stressed out, busy, and so on. So
fantastic. Thank you so much. And what is the audience of the book? So what is your target audience?
Yeah, well, that was really, it was something I've been wanting to do for a while. So the audience of the book was, excuse me, was everybody. It was my book group of friends, for example. Okay. I felt in my academic writing, I'd reached other academics. Some of my writing, my earlier book had been reaching business executives. In this book, we really wanted to speak to everybody. So whether it was, parents of young kids or older people or business people or sports figures, we were trying to reach everyone. So that was trying to do something new, and it was fun to do it.
Yeah, fantastic. I look forward to reading it. So we're talking today about case studies. So I want to go back to your early days of looking into case studies and developing the method. So what initially inspired you to develop case studies, and what keeps you going over so many years?
Okay, yeah. So what initially inspired me was being out in the field, collecting data that was supposed to be for a quantitative study on decision making, and sort of realizing after collecting data on probably 10 or 12 teams at companies, that we were finding super interesting ideas and insights, and that was then came at the same time that there was a call for papers at Management Science. And so Jay Bourgeois, who I was working with then, and I said to ourselves, well, let's stop. We've already have great data. Let's stop and let's write a paper for this special issue on, and I can't even remember what it was about. And then the third kind of coincidental thing in this perfect storm was that Bob Sutton had joined the faculty and he had done a qualitative dissertation at University of Michigan. And so we had this really interesting data, the call, and then we could bounce ideas about Bob, about what we were supposed to do, and we wrote the paper. And R.A. Lewin, who was the editor of the special issue, who then went on to be the founding editor of Organization Science, really liked the paper. And R.A. has always had a taste for things that are different. And so he then made the paper happen in terms of getting through the publication process.
Fantastic. Many happy coincidence resulted.
Yes.
Excellent. And now that you have a lot of experience, or all the years that went by, how did you keep going on case studies? What is the uniqueness of them that that attracts you to it as a scientist, as a social scientist?
Yeah, I think what attracts me is that the phenomenon are always a little bit bigger than most quantitative studies. In most quantitative studies, and this is not a particular criticism, but they are inherently narrower. The research question is typically tighter. And case study, the questions are often more open-ended. There's less known about what the answer is. And so I think I like that, and I like field data. So it was a sort of, the sort of ability to look at a completely open area with field data that I think was initially and continues to be what I enjoy. I've drifted, I have done quantitative studies. I have done simulations, I've done lab studies. So I've done lots of kinds of studies, but I always come back to the cases, and now I'm pretty much exclusively doing the cases.
Oh,
although I did machine learning. Machine learning is actually very much of a pattern recognition technique, just like, in fact, the logic of machine learning is almost identical to multi-case theory building.
So yeah, so it's like, perhaps what I hear from you is like going through from one side, perhaps developing variance, right, and difference, or seeing it up front, and then developing from the ground up at the same time.
Right, or yeah, it's not always seeing difference. Sometimes it's just seeing something you haven't seen before.
To start with, right?
Yeah, it's often variance, because I'm kind of a variance person. But sometimes it's just, well, that's really interesting. How does that work?
Excellent, thank you so much. So the next question comes from one of our PhD students at the University of Kent and the School of Computing, Nandita Patnaik, and she's asking about case studies, and we know that they combine different types of evidence, qualitative and quantitative. Hence, obviously, then the aim is to organize appropriately the qualitative and quantitative evidence and present a coherent and convincing evidence-based story. Could perhaps we hear from you how to appropriately organize mixed evidence, quantitative and qualitative, and maybe also, if possible, to highlight what might be inappropriate at the same time?
Okay. Yeah. Excuse me. Yeah. I haven't done a study of like what everybody else does, but excuse me. I know what I do. And often the combination occurs when there's a variable in the study that's a well-known variable, like conflict or power, or even size. But something, let's take conflict as if conflict is emerging from the cases, and a priori you think conflict is going to be important or could be important, then you might measure it quantitatively. So you might, for example, in couple of my original strategic decision-making papers, we measured conflict. How much conflict does Kathleen have with May? Does May have with, I don't know, Andrew? Does Kathleen have with Andrew? So you see, you're measuring it, and you're measuring it on, let's say, some sort of scale, like a 0 to 10 scale. So if you can anticipate a variable, you might want to quantify it. But then in the course of gathering the data, you might also learn some things about other ways to have measured conflict between May and Kathleen that you didn't have quantitatively, but you see in the data. And so then you have then sentences that we may have said, or situations. And so I see the two as triangulating. And what you will often see is that the quantitative data may show you a pattern, like, oh, the conflict seems to be between people who are, let's say it's an international study, between people who are francophones versus anglophones. And you see, oh, I'm seeing that quantitatively. And then the qualitative data will give you insight into why and how. So you'll see numbers that are doing, there's some sort of a pattern, and then the qualitative data will be able to show you what were the underlying reasons and rationale and richness of why it's happening. So the two tend to be complementary. So that's how I've used it. Other people have used it, like some of the ethnographers have. I can't pull a study for you, but have used quantitative study. Marion Glynn has done a bit of it too, where they might measure quantitatively and they might actually run a regression to show something. The way you would do it incorrectly in multi-case is if you average the data across all the cases, because then you'd be violating replication logic. So let's suppose I had a study of top management team, top management team, top management team. I could do the qualitative and quantitative triangulation about May and Kathleen in team one, but then the second team might be Andrew and Stephen, and then you would do theirs, but you wouldn't ever average the conflict across the teams because those are different cases. So that would be the error, is if you try to do what's known as pooled logic across cases and start averaging things. So you don't ever take the average of something across cases.
Right. No,
You
that's
can take
very
averages
helpful.
within cases.
That's really helpful. Very, very interesting indeed. And I didn't realize before that. I thought that you create a level of variance, for example, some variable about size, for example, or origin, or location of cases and so forth. And then you would look completely for different variables or themes that emerge from the data. But now I understand that is also about triangulating and using on the same variable, like conflict, as you said, to create the distinction, but also to see what emerges regarding conflict within each case.
Yeah, so you're trying to triangulate, so using the qualitative and quantitative to triangulate a better measure.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for this. So another question is taking us back a little bit on the 1989, your seminal contribution in the Academy of Management Review, Building Theories from Case Studies Research, where you offer a roadmap for building theories from case studies. In the recent paper by Geman et al., 2018, where basically it was a summary of the Showcase AOM symposium in 2016, which was fascinating as the video, to watch, but also to read the paper. It seems that, when the three of you, Joya, Langley, and Eisenhardt, compare your methods, there was a bit of a tension between the two traditions, the inductive and the deductive. So I was wondering if you could perhaps pinpoint where exactly in a typical comparative case study design the deductive and the inductive logics might be useful, and how.
Okay. Yeah, I think Denny Joya and sort of his method, he doesn't particularly pay attention to inductive and deductive. He doesn't, that sort of.
Yeah, you are the only one. Yeah.
I always saw, I think I've always been, perhaps more than other qualitative researchers, interested in connecting with the deductive world. To me, it's always, I look at our quantitative colleagues, and they're in the majority. They will always be in the majority. Research will always be majority quantitative. And so it always seemed to me that one wanted to connect with them. Whereas other researchers don't care, or not as interested.
Why?
Why did I want to, or why do they?
Yeah, why you want to?
Why I want to is because if you want to influence research and ideas, you have to connect with the mainstream, because that's who's doing most of the talking.
Okay.
So that's why it was important to me. And I also thought about inductive and deductive is two different sides of the same coin. So deductive was you start with a theory and you test it. Inductive is you start with the data and you build the theory.
Yeah.
But they're essentially, they're related. And so that always struck me as useful to think, a way to think, and also a way to think, a way to connect with the larger community. So I always try to not use, if we're talking about some particular aspect of theory building, and I would use the same terms if that were appropriate with quantitative people.
So where would you use the deductive logic in the case study to start?
When you're actually doing a case study, you use it as you're iterating to figure out what the pattern is, which is what you're doing, is you're figuring out a pattern. You might see in let's go back to the Kathleen and May are on a team, and I think I'm seeing a pattern where Europeans, I don't know, Europeans do something that let's say North Americans don't. So then I look in the second case study, say, well, is that true? Were the Europeans doing this thing and the North Americans weren't? Was that true in the second study? So I'm inducting in the first study, coming up with the pattern, and I'm testing to see whether that pattern is the same in every case. So let's say
Okay.
I have 16, the 2 in team 2, the 2 in team 3. So it's deductive in that sense.
Right. So you start from inductive and then you deduce to try to find commonalities.
Yeah, and then if I say, oh, wait a minute, that pattern doesn't fit in any other case, that's the wrong pattern. Go back to a different, look again for another pattern.
Great. That's so helpful. Thank you so much.
And that's why it's like machine learning. That's exactly what machine learning does.
Oh, really? I'm sorry, I don't know about machine learning at all.
Yeah, totally, it's really pretty amazing, but they're pretty similar techniques.
Great. Thank you so much. So the next question is about variants and crafting, creating variants. How should PhD students kickstart their research about variants? How should they go about perhaps selecting cases? So to make sure, that variance is in place.
Selecting cases, is probably one of the parts that's the most different from deductive research. Because we select, qualitative people or theory building people may select on a dependent variable, and you would never do that on a quantitative study. So what you have to think about is, what is it that you really want to study? What's the phenomena you're going after? And then ensuring that, or trying to ensure that the cases that you select are going to highlight that phenomenon, and even as you're controlling for the things you don't care about. So, so to give you an example of a paper, actually it's a paper that of mine. It's now forthcoming at Organization Science, and it compares the DJI, which is the Chinese firm that it's sort of the dominant maker in civilian drones, versus 3DR, which was a U.S. company. And what we actually were not interested in was, we were not particularly interested in China versus US. We were interested in experimentation. And so in choosing those two cases, we chose them because civilian drones has a lot of experimentation. You can't build a drone because it's got components and systems and so on. So we were really looking for a study where we were really looking for cases that really highlighted experimentation. And the beauty of this particular pairing was that they were similar on so many other issues. They were similar on the founding date, and the characteristics of the founding team, and the funding, and the goal, and the product. So you can control out all the things you didn't care about and just focus on experimentation. Or another example is a study that I did with Ben Howland on fundraising. It's in AMJ 2012. And there we wanted to look at how do entrepreneurs fundraise. And if we just do a random sample, you get a lot of entrepreneurs who don't gain funds because they're not very competent, or they have a bad idea, like a lot of reasons that you don't care about. And so what we did was choose firms that already had funding, because they know we could get funding, and then we sort of watched what they did over time. So you try to look, on the one hand, for where is the phenomenon, and on the other hand, look for where the phenomenon exists, but a lot of other factors are being controlled for that you don't care about. And you might care about those at another time, but you don't care about them in the study that you have.
So you start from the phenomenon, and then you look for the different other ways to differentiate.
Right, and then you pick the cases, and so sometimes we look for like an easy one is what we were calling the racing design, which is in the Sull article, where you start. This works really well. If you can start at a common founding time, a common date, like the study starts at a time, and there are 3 or 4 or 5 cases that are all starting at the same time, and then they do, because you controlled for a lot of factors. Or another way we did it was with Jason Davis in Rotating Leadership, which is an ASQ paper about 2011. There we were interested in how does R&D happen between 2 corporations, successful R&D projects. And so what we did was we read the deductive literature about what makes for success. And it's things like, common national culture, and you've worked together before. And there are a few other, the quantitative people have found some things work. And so we said, let's control for all the things that the quantitative people found, and then let's look.
Okay, so you derive the variables of variance from the literature, and then you looked for them while you were also looking for the phenomenon.
Yeah, and so we controlled for essentially, like the literature says, you want, R&D projects work better when the 2 companies have a common national culture, like they're both Italians, or they're both from the States or wherever. So we looked for collaborations like that controlled out that factor. And there's some other factors. So we controlled out the factors the quantitative literature had told us were relevant, and then looked at our study and tracked the case. So we'd gotten rid of all this stuff that we already knew, and now we could really focus on the phenomenon.
Fantastic. Do you ever have emerging factors from the cases and then you use them to create further differentiation? So you can do that as well. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. I did that. Pinar Ozkan, who's your colleague in the UK, and I did that in 2009. We realized we had a study where it was a study of alliance portfolios, and that some of the companies had started their alliance portfolios sooner than the others. And so we had like first movers, and then we had people about 2 or 3 years later. So we looked at how you form alliance portfolios well and poorly, but then we also said, and how is it different if you started at T0 versus 2 years later? And there were certain strategies you could do at the beginning you couldn't do later.
Yeah, brilliant. Thank you so much for clarifying this. Next question comes from Jane Christie. She's a doctoral candidate at Kent Business School, again at the University of Kent. And she's asking you, when you publish new theories, such as your recent decision weaving theoretical framework Houghton Eisenhardt 2020, to what extent do you expect further research, yours or others, to replicate your findings or test your claims on the theory's boundary conditions? In your view, what should the academic community's role be in extending your findings?
Okay, yeah, that's an interesting question. Thank you, Jane. When I first started out, I thought that people would test the theories. You come up with a theory and people would test it. It turns out that doesn't happen that often, because quantitative deductive researchers, it's not easy for them to get the data to test them. Most of us who are doing case study research are doing process studies where you really have to have a deep dive into firms, and most quantitative people can't get that data at the scale they need to have statistical power. So they just can't get the data, and they just can't get the power. So there's occasionally, sometimes some of my stuff has been tested by other people, but not as much as I would have thought when I was just starting out.
Right.
And I think the reason is the data are too hard to get for quantitative people, the kind of data that you would have to get. That said, what I've realized is there are other ways to extend the data and extend the ideas. So, for example, simulation is really, I think, a natural way to take case study results. So, to give the group an example, Jason Davis, Chris Bingham, and I wrote a paper in ASQ on this was optimal something or other and simple rules. So we essentially took some of the case study findings on simple rules and put them into a simulation. And then a simulation let us extend those findings at a larger scale. So simulation and case studies really, I think, pair well. People have used formal modeling. I haven't, but others have, to extend the ideas. So I think when you get outside the narrow view that replicating is quantitative deductive hypothesis testing, and see it can be simulation, it can be formal modeling, it can be machine learning. Then you start to see, also it can be other case studies. So for example, the findings in the OTT study on decision weaving, we actually found again in the experimentation study using DJI and 3DR that I just mentioned.
That's fantastic.
And then we saw that's not the main finding of that. It's not the main insights or main theory that comes out of that paper, but we saw that happen, and we mentioned in the paper, and we saw this pattern and there too. So it replicates. It can replicate other places. So the key point, to answer Jane's question, is that it's hard for deductive researchers to replicate our theory building work. But when you get outside the constraints of it has to be quantitatively replicated, there are other ways in which you can continue to see the phenomenon.
Really interesting and food for thought for using different methods that you highlighted. Thank you so much. So in your 2021 paper, in Strategic Organization Journal, What is the Eisenhardt Method? You offer guidance and shed light in misconceptions. So perhaps you can share with us a few observations of, as you've been doing about published case studies, and offer advice on developing robustness in comparative case studies.
Okay. Yeah, I think, I mean, there are lots of ways to think about robustness. I think the field is really going down the path of in your methods section, telling everything that you did. And that has some value, although it starts to get to be kind of long. And so if I tell you everything I did, it sort of overwhelms the paper. And so I've seen some papers these days where the methods section is just overwhelming. And I don't know that it's really adding a lot of value. To document a creative process is hard to do. So I think the field in some sense has gone overboard on so-called transparency. I think data structures was another error, in the sense that data structures work really well for the kind of work that Denny Joya does, and Denny does great work, but not for everybody. It doesn't work for multiple places. In contrast, I think what is not emphasized as much as it should be is the underlying theoretical logic of the theory. So you often will see the boxes and arrows, but what you won't see is the mechanisms for why those arrows are there. And that, I think, is the big flaw in the papers that I review and in the papers that I read. Is descriptive, but it's ultimately not theoretical. And if it's theoretical, there's an underlying theoretical logic. If there's an arrow and a boxes and arrow diagram going from A to B, and all you've got is the arrow, and you show a correlation or relationship, it's not really very good from a theory point of view. What are the mechanisms, or the mechanism that's driving that relationship? And that's what I think a lot of authors miss.
That's very helpful. Yeah.
So if you see in my own papers, or papers of people who do kind of what I do, there's always a section at the end of this finding that, well, why is this true? And then there's reasons why it's true. Otherwise, you've just written correlation.
Really useful observation for all of us to reflect upon, people who work on case studies and think about the mechanisms, as you say, how to make them more explicit, I suppose, visually as well as in the text.
Yeah, why not just the boxes and arrows diagram, but at least in the text anywhere, somewhere, why it's true.
Yeah, fantastic. Thank you so much. And my final question is, would you have any advice for PhD students who are starting their research in academia? Yeah, jump in the pool. That would be my advice. is jump in the pool and try it. And I think you'll find that it's all pretty logical. So wonderful.
So yes, that's my advice.
Yeah, thank you so much, Professor Kathleen Eisenhardt. It has been a pleasure, and hopefully also useful for the PhD students watching this video for the years to come. So thank you so much again.
Okay, and thank you, May, for including me, and best of luck to everybody at the conference. And I'm sorry I can't be with you more synchronously, but thanks again, May. Great question.
Thank you so much. Bye-bye.